Well, thank you very much for staying here in this dark room, not attending the nice sun outside. In my lecture, I want to ask the question, what does living in and coping with world risk society mean? The best way to start is with one example. A couple of years ago, the US Congress established an expert commission to develop a language or symbolism capable of warning against the threats posed by American nuclear waste dumps 10,000 years from now. The problem to be solved was how must concepts and symbols be designed in order to convey a message to future generations millennia from now. The commission included physicists, anthropologists, linguists, neuroscientists, psychologists, biologists, classical scholars, artists, theologians, etc. The first question it has to address was, will the United States even exist 10,000 years from now? Of course, the US Commission had no trouble answering that question. USA forever. However, the central problem of how to create a model of design to start a conversation with the future, 10,000 years from now, proved to be insolvable. The expert looked for models in the oldest symbols of humanity. They studied the construction of Stonehenge and the pyramids. They examined the historical reception of Homer and the Bible, but these reached back at most a couple of thousand years, not 10,000. The anthropologist recommended the symbol of the skull and crossbones. A historian reminded the commission, however, that the skull and the crossbones symbolized resurrection for the alchemists. And the psychologist conducted an experiment with 3-year-olds. If the symbol was affixed to a bottle, they anxiously scouted poison. But if it was placed on the wall, they enthusiastically yelled pirates. Other scholars proposed paving the ground around the waste site with ceramic, metal, and stone plaque, which characterized as expressing all kinds of warnings. But the linguists were unanimous that they would only be understood for 2,000 years at most. The very scientific sophistication of the commission showed how the crisis of modernity followed from its triumphs. We are not actually, I would say, in a crisis of modernity. We are suffering from the consequences of the victory of modernity, the unwanted and unseen consequences of the victory of modernity. And here even, we have one of the indicators, even language fails when faced with the task of warning future generations against the dangers we have introduced into the world by using high modern technologies. In this lecture, I want to investigate the irony of risk. Risk is ambivalence. Being at risk is a way of being and ruling in the world of modernity. Being at global risk is a human condition at the beginning of the 21st century of world risk society. But against the grain of the current widespread feeling of doom, I would like to ask, what is the wrath of history, which is also inherent in world risk society and emerges with its realization? Or more tightly formulated, is there an enlightenment function, a cosmopolitan moment of world risk society? So what are the opportunities of climate change and the financial crisis? And what form do they take? There is a nostalgia built into foundations of European social science thought, which has never disappeared. Perhaps paradoxically, this nostalgia can be overcome with a theory of world risk society. My aim is a non-nostalgic, new critical theory to look at the past and the futures of modernity. In my argument, I want to keep the two contradictory views within modernity, self-destructiveness and ability to begin anew, in balance with one another. I would like to demonstrate this here in 3 steps, drawing on empirical research in my Munich Research Center on Reflexive Modernization. First, old dangers, new risk. What is new about world risk society? Second, cosmopolitan moment, what does this mean? Third, consequences, is there a need for a paradigm shift in the social sciences? Old dangers, new risk, what is new about world risk society? Modern society has become a risk society in the sense that it is increasingly occupied with debating, preventing, and managing risk that it itself has produced. That may well be, many will object, but it demonstrates rather a hysteria and politics of fear produced by the mass media. On the contrary, would not someone looking at Western society from the outside have to acknowledge that the risks which get us worked up are luxury risks, more than any else? After all, our world appears a lot safer than that, say, of the war-torn regions in Africa, Afghanistan, or the Middle East. Our modern society is not distinguished precisely by the fact that to a large extent they have succeeded in bringing under control contingencies and uncertainties with respect to accidents, violence, and sickness and crises. As true as such observations may be, they miss the most obvious point about risk. That is the key distinction between risk and catastrophe. Risk does not mean catastrophe. Risk means the anticipation of catastrophe. We have to distinguish between the future and the present future. The future is in principle unknown. We are always talking about the future, but the future is in principle unknown. We are actually, when we talk about the future, we anticipate the future by all kinds of means which we have. Those might be mathematical models or might be some kinds of designed and visualizations, symbolic forms, staging, mediation, and so on. So it is actually the anticipated future, the present future, which makes us acting and thinking. And this is an important difference. It is especially an important difference in a time, and I will come to this right away, where we anticipate new kind of catastrophes beyond our means of control. The old paradigmatic threat to security has not become obsolete since the end of the Cold War. There are still states that compete for territory and resources and threaten each other militarily. But the dangers which are more clearly perceived since the end of the East-West conflict are quite different, are from a quite different order. They often lack clarity, identifiable agents, a hostile intent, or military potential. The danger is not direct, intentional, and definite. States which face risks and dangers rather than enemies are involved in a completely different logic. They have actually no need to see the world in terms of enemy images, but do need to see the world in terms of transnational cooperation in order to cope with the risks which they cannot control nationally. This is what theory of world risk society maintains. Modern societies are shaped by new kinds of risks and manufactured uncertainties. Their foundations are shaken by global anticipation of global catastrophes. Such perceptions of global risk are characterized by 3 features. First, delocalization, Its causes and consequences are not limited to one geographical location or space. They are in principle omnipresent, and actually there's nobody from the system who is responsible for them. There's an organized irresponsibility in relation to those consequences. Second, incalculableness. Its consequences were in principle incalculable. At bottom, it's a matter of hypothetical risks, which not least are based on science-induced not knowing and normative dissent. So actually, I think you were talking, we were discussing this in the session before already, but this is actually part of the definition of world risk society. We are not only confronted by risk or risk-taking, but we are confronted by the attempts to control risk and thereby produce even new and unknown, anticipated catastrophes for which actually our knowledge is incomplete, or maybe in principle incomplete as well. And the third feature is non-compensability, the security dream of first modernity based on the mastery of unsafe consequences and dangers of decision. Accidents could occur as long as and because they were considered compensable. Once the global financial system has collapsed, once climate change has changed irrevocable, once terrorist groups possess weapons of mass destruction, then it is too late. Given this new quality of threats to humanity, the logic of compensation breaks down and is replaced by the principle of precaution by prevention. Those are events which are not allowed to happen. We imagine them in order that they could not happen, and therefore actually the mechanism of learning, which we so far actually institutionalize in risk-taking and trying to find out about how we can manage and cope with those risks, don't work anymore. The discovery of incalculability of risk is closely connected to the discovery of the importance of not knowing to risk calculation. And it is part of another kind of irony that surprisingly this discovery of not knowing occurred in a scholarly discipline which today no longer wants to have anything to do with it, the economics. It was Frank Knight and John Maynard Keynes who early insisted on the distinction between predictable and non-predictable, or calculable and non-calculable forms of contingency. In a famous article, Keynes wrote 1937, "By uncertain knowledge," I quote, "by uncertain knowledge, let me explain, I do not mean merely to distinguish what is known from what is merely probable. The sense in which I am using the term is that in which the price of copper and the rate of interest 20 years hence, all the obsolescence of a new invention are uncertain. About these matters, there is no scientific basis which to form any calculable probability whatsoever. We simply do not know." However, Keynes' admonition to open up the field of economics decision-making to the unknown, to the non-knowable of future systematic catastrophes hidden in normalized practices of risk-taking was neglected in the subsequent development of mainstream economics, including mainstream Keynesian economics. The crucial point, however, is not only the discovery of importance of not knowing, but that simultaneously the knowledge, control, and security claim of state and society were indeed had to be renewed, deepened, and expanded. On the other side, the expansion of not knowing. On the other hand, the important principle of control and security of state, businesses, and society. The irony lies in the institutionalized security claim to have to control something even if one does not know whether it really exists. But why should a science or a discipline concern itself with what it does not even know? There is certainly a conclusive sociological answer to this, because in the face of the production of manufactured uncertainties, societies more than ever relies and insists on security and control. Second, what is meant by cosmopolitan moment? World Risk Society is a latent revolutionary society in which the state of normalcy and the state of emergency overlap. From this, one can explain the historical power of global risk, which is neglected by economics and sociology of risk. In dealing with catastrophic risks, the present of a future state of emergency is being negotiated. The anticipated state of emergency is no longer national, but transnational, at the end maybe even cosmopolitical. The belief that the risk facing humanity can be averted by political action taken on behalf of endangered humanity becomes an unprecedented resource for consensus, legitimation, nationally and internationally, all kinds of conflicts. In this sense, the fundamental principles of modernity, including free market principle, the nation-state order itself, become subject to change, to controversies, the existence of alternatives, and different pictures of possible futures. So what is cosmopolitan about the cosmopolitan moment? Global risks tear down national boundaries and jumble together the native with the foreign. The distant other is becoming the inclusive other, not through mobility, but through the perception of catastrophe. Everyday life is becoming cosmopolitan. Human beings must find a meaning of life in the exchange with others and no longer in the encounter with the like. We all are trapped in a shared global space of threat without exit. This may inspire highly conflicting responses to which renationalization, xenophobia also belong. I actually cannot think of any power inducing and forcing such a global learning process in such a short period of time. Be careful again, not catastrophe does this, but the anticipation of catastrophe does it. Global risk is highly ambivalent, paradoxically also a moment of hope, of unbelievable opportunities, a cosmopolitan moment. Also, some insist on seeing an overreaction to risk. Mostly this is the case. Global risk conflicts do indeed have an enlightenment function. They destabilize the existing order, but can also be seen as a vital step towards the construction of new institutions. Global risk has the power to confuse the mechanism of organized irresponsibility and even to open them up for political action. Egoism, autonomy, autopoiesis, self-isolation, improbability of translation, these are key terms for describing modern society in sociology and in public discussions and political debates as well. The communicative logic of global risk must be understood on precisely the opposite principle. World risk is the unwanted, unintended, obligatory medium of communication in a world of reconcilable differences in which everyone is turning on their own axis. Hence, the public perception of risk forces people to communicate who otherwise do not want to have anything to do with one another. It imposes obligations and costs on those who resist them, even with the law on their side. In other words, large-scale risk cut through the self-sufficiency of cultures, languages, religions, and systems as much as though the national and international agenda of politics. They overturn their priorities and create context for action between camps, parties, quarreling nations that know nothing about each other and reject and oppose one another. The strategies of action which global risk open up overthrow the order of power which has formed in the neoliberal capital state coalition. Global risk empowers states and civil society movements because they reveal new resources of legitimation and options for action for these groups and actors. They disempower global capital, on the other hand, because the consequences of economic decisions contribute to the creating of global risks and destabilize markets and even the global market system altogether. Conversely, there is an opportunity to bring about what I would like to call a cosmopolitan form of statehood, a state which defines, a nation state which defines it's not only on national terms, but on the need to cooperate with others, other states, other nations in order to solve their own national problems. This is not wishful thinking. On the contrary, it's an expression of a cosmopolitan realpolitik. In an age of global risk, a politics of golden handcuffs, the creation of a dense network of transnational independency is exactly what is needed in order to regain national sovereignty, not least in relation to highly mobile world economy. The maxims of nation-based realpolitik, that national interest must necessarily be pursued by national means, must be replaced by the maxims of cosmopolitan realpolitik. In world risk society, nationalism is becoming the enemy of the nation. Third and last consequences, a paradigm shift in the social sciences. It is evident that the taken for granted nation-state frame of reference, which I call methodological nationalism, prevents the social sciences from understanding and analyzing the dynamics and ambivalences, opportunities and ironies of world risk society. Methodological nationalism is actually the fundamental feature of the social sciences. In their thinking, in their organizations, in their research methods, because they have been invented and developed in the 19th century. They are pretty much using the nation state as a unit of research, and everything good and bad is actually related to the nation state. It's democracy, it's the state itself, it's class conflict, it's family, all of them are related to the nation state, and we are living in an interdependent, even risk-producing world in which this point of view and this methodology is actually blinds us to reality, and is a very deep and I think important criticism which has to be picked up in order to just open up to the reality we experience in national contexts. Sociology and political science are not the only disciplines under pressure. Economics is too. There is a situation vacant. A theorist is thought to succeed Mr. Keynes in transnational terms. The need is now for a clever reflexive regulation philosophy on global scale, including new actors like transnational corporations, World Bank, Attack, Greenpeace, etc. But the greatest need of all is a new theory of mixed economy framed for the global marketplace of today as a new defunct Keynesian system was framed for the national post-war economics. We are under the spell of a sociology and social sciences whose foundations were conceived and developed in the past 100 and 150 years. The first century of social science is over, on the way into the second, which has now begun. The space of sociological imagination and research has to be opened up and determined anew. What we need is a cosmopolitan turn in the social sciences. A cosmopolitan sociology clearly distinguishes itself from a nationalist one because it doesn't start out from something abstract, usually derived from a European historical experience and context, like society, world system, individual, etc. Instead, key concepts like transformation, like contingency, ambivalence, interconnectedness, or cosmopolitization take center stage along with the methodological questions posed by them. Cosmopolitan social sciences therefore opens up indispensable new perspectives on seemingly isolated, familiar, local and national context. With this new cosmopolitan vision, it follows the methodological paths which other disciplines such as contemporary anthropology, geography, ethnology have already taken with enthusiasm. At the end, coming back to the issue I raised at the beginning of my lecture, what is good about something that is bad? The nationalistic egotism has to open up in a cosmopolitan direction for its own sake. Thus, there is a cosmopolitan nationalism or a national cosmopolitanism in the making. And, of course, other alternative modernities are possible. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Professor, thank you so much for that absolutely fascinating presentation. I wonder if I could take the liberty of the first question.
Sure.
Or two. If I heard you correctly, I thought there was a slight tension between the descriptive part of your analysis and the predictive part, the beginning and the end, basically. If I heard you correctly, in the beginning, you saw an ambivalent universe, one with an unprecedented level or type of risk, but very much in equipoise between negative and positive risk, or risk and opportunity. Toward the end, I thought you were moving quite clearly and passionately even toward one side of that balance. The idea that global governance would more likely than not win out over the current patterns, nation state or traditional capital. But I'm wondering, have I...
No, this might be...
you only have 20 minutes to talk, so...
That might be a correct impression of the short lecture I give. But I think it's, as I said at the beginning, we are in a very ambivalent situation. On the one hand, risk, and I'm talking, well, I have to say now since 25 years, about risk society as a stage of modernity in which the institutions we have developed to cope with uncertainty, which is created by modernity, are not able to produce this uncertainty, to produce this certainty, because they are so successful, they have consequences which go beyond the nation state, which go beyond our imagination of all kinds of things. But there's a strong relationship, if you look at this, between global risk or world risk society and cosmopolitanism in a twofold sense. One sense is that actually it is more a fact that in order to cope with global risk, we have to include even the excluded other. We have to cooperate with people and nations and cultures which we don't know. They're actually part of our inner problem, at home, in private relationships, as well as in politics, in businesses, and so on. But this is a factual thing. And people really can protest against this. They don't like this. I would even say the way of renationalization we experience, take Europe as an example, is a reaction to the situation of experienced interconnectedness, of being forced to some extent to cooperate with people which you maybe not even like, which you maybe not even know. Like the Germans and the Greeks suddenly have those problems of inequality. This is a factual thing, and this factual thing has very ambivalent consequences. I would say there's a to take German terms, there's a Hegel scenario, List der Vernunft, like I said, try to say it, in which actually the states, and I press this position very much, the states and even the people to some extent realize that they need to cooperate or fail. They need to cooperate in order to prevent failing. And this is to some extent even you can experience this in Europe right now. But at the same time, and maybe even more powerful, there is a Carl Schmitt scenario, which tries to use the emergency, which is actually part of the risk experiences, to introduce all kind of nationalist politics and xenophobia. Maybe this is a little bit too dark white picture because those two tendencies, as I try, are mixed. But I wanted, since everybody is talking only about the negative side, I just wanted to show that risk is capable of opening up new spaces of action.
What about the Durkheim scenario?
The Durkheim scenario is just on ongoing differentiation and integration. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it fits to this situation, mm-hmm. because actually, as I said, by just doing more modernity, being more modern, making more functional differentiation, having better technology, having all kind of communication, we are producing a situation in which the institutions we have so far invented don't fit to this situation anymore.
Well, let me push you just on that a little bit. How different are we from our forebears in this relationship to risk?
Well,
we feel we are unique. Today must be different from the past. But I mean, if you were living in a village in Germany in the 16th century, you could have been overrun by an invading army. If you'd been living in a village in France in the 14th century, you could have been wiped out by a plague. Into the 19th, when did this start? When did the cosmopolitan moment begin? There's a famous Philip Larkin poem that says intercourse started in 1963. When did the cosmopolitan moment start?
Well, let me first answer your first question, which actually is one of the main misunderstandings, I would say, in relation to risk. Risk is actually related to decision making. It's not a natural catastrophe, at least not as we see it. It's a matter, it's related to modernity. It's where individuals and companies and sciences and politics take decisions and therefore have to take the consequences of their decision. And now we are living in a situation, as I tried to point out, that we are anticipating catastrophes which we never experienced in the past. We are anticipating a breakdown in the economic system. We are anticipating a climate change which totally changes our living conditions. We are anticipating all this, and this is actually changing our institution basically. I'm not sure what the future is going to be. I'm not sure. The future is something which we do not know. But this kind of anticipation of catastrophe induces political action and mobilizes people beyond borders and on all kinds of differences. And this is a cosmopolitan moment. The cosmopolitan moment is maybe related to climate change discussions, to 9/11. You know, even in 9/11, if you remember, even the French newspaper Le Monde titled, "We are all Americans." You know, even the French paper. So I think those are moments where we suddenly realize we are confronted with potential catastrophes which unite us to some extent or need new kind of actions.
Questions in the audience out there? Sir, could you get them? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jeremy from Australia. I'm interested in whether the cosmopolitan moment could be applied not just to nation states, but also potentially to companies, whether having risk isolated in one company is perhaps unrealistic and it might spill out across entire industries. Would you say it's possible to make that extrapolation of the framework?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not specialized in those issues, but I think global companies who actually do understand their situation as looking at their own internal business from a point of view that they need the globe to understand what is going on internally, that they have to react to, I don't know, 80 different cultures and nations, and have to somehow produce this kind of cosmopolitan moment, are actually part of this process. And if you, again, I have to excuse, I'm maybe passionate in trying to find a positive point of view as well. I think they experience that learning to relate to different cultures and different mixtures is not an obstacle, but is a very productive force. And it is a necessity on the one side, and it is a very productive force for all kinds of problems they are confronted with.
There was another question. Sir?
Hello, my name is Martin Seiler from Austria. Professor Beck, as a sociologist, maybe you could comment on a phenomenon which I think can be perceived in our society. On the one hand, in our professional life, we try to assess risks, we try to prevent risks, we try to mitigate risks, we try to predict risks, and so on. On the other hand, I think in our private lives, many people are actually looking for risks. Look at, for instance, people like me who are engaging in extreme sports, people riding motorcycles, people investing in the stock market. Is this a phenomenon which is maybe related to the fact that we need a certain sense of having risks, maybe because life would be too boring without it? What is the view of a sociologist on that?
Well, I'm not quite sure if I really got the point of your question. First of all, I think indeed risk is the adventure. Risk is something which is thrilling. Risk is about the future, which can be changed, which is dependent on our own action, our own knowledge, our courage. I think this is actually what modernity is in principle about, taking those kind of risks. But as I try to argue, and of course this is still an attitude in sports, in many ways of getting the thrill out of this kind of experiences. But in relation to the sociological point of view, first of all, I would say, at least, well, there are many sociologists, and I'm talking about my sociology, but I would say it's not only my sociology. We are not so much interested in constructing models how industries or managements can cope with risk. I think this is I often admire those people who are able to do this, because at least I would think that if you are a scientist, you have to know about the uncertainties of those models, and you just have to tell everybody those are just mixtures of uncertainties, and I don't know whatever mathematics I put in there, it is still manufactured uncertainties. But the sociological point of view is mainly to show that in relation to the institutionalized forms of controlling risk, I give you the example of private insurance as one of the main issues. In relation to those institutionalized resources or probability calculus, we are living in a world where those principles don't function anymore. If you want a definition of world risk society, it is a society which acts in the main issues of modernity beyond private insurance. Take atomic plants as an example. They are state insured, but they are not very good state insured either. So actually it is beyond all the means of control which we have so far institutionalized. And I think this is a more structural picture which sociologists paint, trying to understand the dynamics of legitimation and transformation, which is actually induced by those processes in which we have institutionalized forms of calculation of uncertainty, which for most of the people evidently don't fit to the problems we are producing.
I think we have time for one more question. Anyone over on this side? Everyone over? Okay. Right behind you. Thank you. So last question.
Just wondering if there's a way that you could frame the World Risk Society in terms of ways that we could use it in our lives or in our businesses once we leave this room.
I didn't understand any.
Do you have any practical advice for the implications of World Risk Society for...
Well, as I said, this is actually not the case I'm talking about. I would like to give a practical advice. I would say, why don't, one of the basic experiences actually, which we see in history in relation to self-produced uncertainty by modernity, is the insurance principle. And the insurance principle is actually a huge success, a huge invention in modernity. And I'm wondering why nobody really talks about introducing insurance into banking system, finance system, private insurance, just not state insurance as we have it now, where suddenly the state has to get in, but introduce the principle, do the same thing as needed for a motor car. If you want to drive a motor car without private insurance, you are going to be a criminal. If you drive a banking system and a financial system without private insurance, you're going to be a criminal. If you change, this would be, I think, one interesting change which really could, on the one hand, being very small, on the other hand, have huge implications.
We could have a long discussion of credit default swaps. Thank you so much, Professor Beck. Very illuminating. Thanks for joining us in St. Gallen.
Thank you.